There's a memory I keep returning to, the way a tongue finds a sawtooth. Not because it hurts exactly, but because something in the body needs to confirm that it's still there. It's a Saturday morning in late September, 3 years before any of this happened, and I'm standing in the kitchen with 2 cups of coffee, watching my wife Claire read the newspaper at the table, the way she always did, with one foot tucked beneath her, and her reading glasses pushed slightly down her nose. The light was coming through the east window at a low angle, that particular kind of morning light that makes everything it touches look like it belongs in a painting rather than an ordinary life. She looked up at me over the glasses and said, without preamble, "If the world ever ended, I think you'd actually be fine." I laughed. I handed her the coffee, and I said something dismissive, the way you do when someone hands you a compliment wrapped in a hypothetical, and she smiled and went back to her paper. And the morning continued in its ordinary way, and I did not think about what she'd said again for a very long time. I think about it now, though, often. I think about the fact that she said you and not we, and whether she knew something about herself that she hadn't told me yet, or whether she simply meant it as an observation about my temperament, and nothing more. I think about the light in that kitchen and the weight of those 2 cups of coffee, one of them exactly the way she liked it. I think about the newspaper, local news, ordinary problems, proposed development on the edge of the county, a high school football team on a winning streak, a story about a man who'd found an arrowhead while digging a foundation for a new deck. The world that existed inside that newspaper, how complete it seemed, how entirely it did not prepare any of us for what was coming. My name is Thomas Calloway. I'm 48 years old, and I spent the first 23 years of my adult life working in municipal infrastructure. Water systems primarily, the kind of invisible engineering that keeps a city functioning without anyone noticing it's happening. Pipe networks, pumping stations, filtration plants, the hydraulic logic of moving clean water toward people and wastewater away from them. It's unglamorous work, and I was good at it, and what it gave me, beyond a technical education, was a particular way of seeing any complex system, not as a set of visible surfaces, but as a network of interdependencies, each element meaningful only in relation to what it connects to and what fails when it goes. A city, when you've spent your career maintaining its circulatory systems, stops feeling like a place and starts feeling like an organism. And an organism has failure modes. I knew them well. I'd spent 2 decades studying what happens when one part of the network experiences stress, and how that stress propagates outward through connected systems, and how quickly the whole structure can shift from functioning to failed when the cascade begins. This knowledge, which had always felt abstract and theoretical in the context of ordinary infrastructure management, turned out to be the most important thing I owned when the outbreak began. Claire died 4 years before that. Ovarian cancer, diagnosed late, moved fast, the way those things sometimes do, with a cruelty that seems almost intentional. She was 51. Our daughter, Nora, was 22 at the time and had recently moved to Portland for a graphic design position she'd been working toward for years. Our son, Ben, was 19 and in his 2nd year of college in the city. My city, which is a mid-sized place in the Pacific Northwest that I won't name specifically, not because of secrecy, but because the name no longer seems to belong to the place it describes. Cities, I've learned, are more fragile than their names suggest. After Claire died, I stayed in the house. There were people who suggested I shouldn't, that the square footage of a 4-bedroom house was too much grief for one person, that I should downsize, move closer to Nora or Ben, start fresh. I understood the logic. I stayed anyway. Partly because of the garden, which Claire had spent 15 years building into something genuinely beautiful, and which seemed to require continuation as a matter of respect. Partly because the house sat on just under 3 acres at the edge of the city's suburban boundary, backing up against a green belt that connected, through a series of trails and undeveloped corridors, to a larger stretch of forest about 2 miles east. And partly, I think, because I'd already begun, without fully acknowledging it to myself, to think about the property differently. Not as a family home that had outlived its original purpose, as a resource, as a set of characteristics that had value I hadn't yet fully measured. The last ordinary week of my life was a week in late November. I remember the specific texture of it now, the low grey sky that had been there for days, the way the city sounded in the mornings when I drove Ben to the transit station, the particular smell of the coffee shop on the corner of my block, where I'd been going for years, a place run by a woman named Sylvie who knew my order and always gave me a few extra minutes of warmth before I headed back out into the November cold. Ben had come home for a long weekend, which was a thing he did every few weeks. He was close enough that distance didn't feel like absence, and our relationship had developed in the years since his mother died into something I valued more than I could easily articulate. We were both engineers in our thinking, both interested in how systems worked, both somewhat more comfortable with problems that had solutions than with problems that didn't. We watched a basketball game Saturday evening and argued about the structural integrity of the arena's roof truss design, which is the kind of conversation that I recognized as our particular form of closeness. He'd gone back to campus Sunday. I'd watched the truck disappear around the corner and felt the familiar shape of the empty house settling back around me, and I'd gone inside and made dinner and turned on the evening news without much intention of watching it. That was when I first heard the word Ashford. It didn't mean anything to me then, a town in eastern Oregon, small, agricultural, the kind of place you drive through on the way to somewhere larger without registering. The news report was brief and cautious in that early-stage way, a local anchor reading from a prepared statement about a health incident under investigation by state authorities, a reminder to call emergency services if you observed anyone exhibiting certain behaviors that were listed in language clinical enough to be technically honest and practically useless. I watched it with the half attention of someone who has heard many alarming news reports and learned that most of them resolve into something manageable. I watched the follow-up report on Monday morning with slightly more attention. By Wednesday, I was watching every broadcast I could find. Or there's a specific cognitive event that happens when a professional who understands systems watches a system begin to fail. It's different from the experience of a layperson watching the same event, not because the professional is smarter or more important, but because the pattern recognition trained into them by years of work activates in ways that aren't voluntary. It's like hearing a familiar song in a language you've spent years learning. The meaning arrives before you've consciously processed it. What I was watching by Wednesday evening was the early stages of a network failure cascade, and I knew, in the non-negotiable way that you know things that your professional experience has calcified into reflex, that it was not going to stop on its own, and the details of what was spreading, the precise nature of what was happening to people in Ashford, and then in Pendleton, and then in 2 districts of Portland that bordered heavily trafficked freight corridors. I don't want to dwell on in clinical terms because the clinical terms don't fully capture what it meant, and the fuller description is not something that lends itself to calm recounting. What I will say is this: it was fast, it was communicable under conditions that the initial public health framing significantly underrepresented, and the behavioral profile of affected individuals was such that the ordinary protocols for managing an infectious disease outbreak, isolation, treatment, containment, were not going to function as designed. The infected were mobile, they were not rational, and they did not respond to instruction or barrier. And they were, once past a certain stage of the illness, operating on something that looked less like behavior and more like pure drive, directionless, ceaseless, oriented toward any evidence of uninfected human presence. I sat with this information for a long time on Wednesday night, not in panic. Panic is a luxury that spends itself quickly and leaves you with nothing. I sat in the way I had learned to sit with the reality of my wife's diagnosis, allowing the information to be fully true without flinching from it, because flinching from true things is how you end up planning for a world that doesn't exist. The world I was now in had a shape I could work with. It had specific failure modes I could model, and it had a timeline, not precise, but inferable from the rate of geographic spread I was tracking against the highway and rail network maps I'd pulled up on my laptop, that gave me something more useful than fear. It gave me a deadline. My best estimate, working from the spread patterns and the known population density corridors between Portland and my city, was 7 days, perhaps 6, if the freight routes moved faster than I was modeling. Perhaps 8 or 9 if any of the containment measures being announced achieved even partial effect, which I considered unlikely but not impossible. 7 days. I closed the laptop. I picked up a legal pad from the kitchen counter. I began to think. The first thing I wrote at the top of the legal pad was not a list of supplies or a construction plan. It was 2 phone numbers, Nora's and Ben's, and I called them both before I wrote another word. Nora answered immediately, which meant she was already watching the news. She was calm in the way that people raised in a household where calm is modeled learn to be calm, genuinely controlled, not suppressed, with the specific quality of composure that comes from knowing the adults around you were steady when things were hard. She'd been in Portland when the first cases appeared there, and she'd already moved, driven south to a friend's property in the Willamette Valley, the kind of decision that told me she had been paying attention and trusting her instincts. I told her to stay there. I told her to fill every container she could find with clean water. I told her I would find a way to reach her when I was able, but that she should not wait for me if circumstances required her to move again. She said, "I know, Dad." And then, after a brief pause, "Are you scared?" I thought about that honestly. I said, "No, I'm busy." She understood what I meant. Ben was harder to reach. His phone went to voicemail twice before he picked up, sounding like someone who had been asleep and woken to a world that had rearranged itself in the interval. He was on campus, which was not yet in the affected radius, but was only 30 miles from my location, and I walked him through a specific set of decisions with the methodical clarity I'd used to walk him through engineering problems since he was old enough to understand them. Stay in the dormitory for now, don't use the main roads, keep the car fueled. When the situation became untenable on campus, he had a route to my property that avoided the interstate entirely. We'd driven it once together, on a Sunday afternoon the previous spring, for reasons I hadn't fully explained at the time, and he hadn't pushed me on because he was his mother's son and understood that some things announce themselves when they're ready. I told him that when he arrived, he should come to the back of the property, that there would be a marker on the fence post at the greenbelt boundary, 3 orange flagging tape strips, and he should follow the trail from there. He was quiet for a moment, processing. Then he'd said, "You already know what you're doing, don't you?" I said, "I'm working on it." After I put the phone down, I stood in the kitchen for a while with my hands on the counter, looking out the window at the backyard in the dark. The garden was in its late autumn state, beds put to rest, the larger shrubs still holding some shape against the dark, the apple tree a bare architecture of branches against the slightly lighter sky. Beyond the fence, the green belt was a soft blackness, quiet, the way land is quiet when it hasn't yet been asked to do anything. I'd always liked that view. I'd liked the way the property ended at the edge of something unbuilt, the way the city stopped being the city just beyond the fence. I turned back to the legal pad and started the first real list. Resource mapping comes before anything else. This is the first principle I'd learned in infrastructure work, and the one I applied most rigorously in the first hours of planning. You cannot make intelligent decisions about what to acquire if you don't have an accurate picture of what you already have, and you cannot make accurate decisions about what to build if you don't understand what your site offers. Wish lists are useful. Reality inventories are essential. What the property offered when I walked it with a flashlight at 10 o'clock on Wednesday night, with the legal pad in one hand and a measuring tape in the other, was more than I'd consciously accounted for. The house had a full basement with a reinforced concrete floor and walls, originally built with a storm shelter designation by a previous owner who had moved here from tornado country and imported his anxieties. The basement had a separate exterior access through a pair of horizontal steel doors set into the ground at the north side of the house, the kind that required a key from outside and could be secured with a sliding bar from within. The main entry point from inside the house was a door at the bottom of the interior stairs, solid core wood, which I could reinforce. Beyond the basement, the property had a well, not currently active, the original infrastructure predating the city water connection and capped but structurally intact. I'd had it inspected when I bought the property and told it was in good condition, simply unmaintained. Bringing it back into service was a project I'd placed in an indefinite mental queue. That queue was now being cleared with considerable urgency. The Greenbelt access was a resource of a different kind, or not for immediate shelter, but for movement. The ability to travel east without using roads, through 2 miles of connected green corridor toward the larger forest and the watershed land beyond it. This was not a primary plan. It was the kind of secondary option that I believed in maintaining, even when I hoped never to use it, because the value of an exit is not in using it, but in knowing it's there. I had a workshop behind the house, a converted single-car garage I'd filled with tools over 15 years, a table saw, a bandsaw, a full complement of hand tools, a welder, a drill press, pneumatic equipment fed by a compressor, lumber and raw materials in various states of usefulness, the accumulated excess of years of projects, hardware in an organized system I could navigate in the dark if required. And I had a vehicle, a 10-year-old diesel pickup that I'd maintained carefully because I'd learned from years of infrastructure work that the equipment you depend on most is the equipment you should care for most. Full tank. Oil recently changed. Tires good. I had, in the pantry and the chest freezer and the basement storage, what I estimated at 5 to 6 weeks of food at normal consumption, which could be extended to 3 or 4 months, with careful rationing and the supplemental production from the garden. Not much at this time of year, but some roots still in the ground, the apple tree's last fruits preserved in the form of jars of sauce, and dried rings that Claire's recipe had become mine by necessity. I had medical supplies beyond the ordinary household level. I'd maintained a comprehensive kit since Ben's childhood, when his interest in anything mechanical had made injuries a regular occurrence, and I'd never downsized it. I had antibiotics from a dental prescription 3 months ago that I hadn't finished. I had suture materials left from a laceration I'd treated on a camping trip 2 summers before because the urgent care clinic was an hour away, and I'd talked to a nurse friend about technique and done it myself. I had, finally, a specific piece of knowledge about the basement that most people wouldn't have thought to apply. I knew its hydraulic relationship to the water table on this property. I knew where the sump pump pulled from and how the drainage ran and what the perimeter conditions looked like in extended wet weather. I knew this space the way I knew any infrastructure I'd maintained, not abstractly, but specifically, in the detail that comes from having actually been inside its systems. The basement could be made into a viable shelter, not glamorous, not comfortable in the conventional sense, but viable, sustainable for months if the preparation was thorough. I went back to the legal pad and started the actual plan. Thursday began at 4 in the morning, which was when my mind, having processed the plan overnight, in whatever way minds do their processing without the conscious self's involvement, delivered the complete priority sequence and declined to let me sleep further. I accepted this with the equanimity of a man who has learned that his unconscious is frequently more efficient than he is, and I got up and made coffee and read through the legal pad from the previous night. The plan was good. More importantly, because it was executable, not dependent on ideal conditions or resources I'd have to hope were available, but built from what I had with specific contingencies mapped for the most likely failure points. I added 3 items I'd thought of in the early morning, crossed out one approach that I'd reconsidered, and circled 4 tasks in red that required early action because they had dependencies. Things that other things couldn't happen until after. The first of those was the well.
I spent 4 hours on Thursday morning assessing and beginning the restoration of the old well. The cap came off without significant difficulty. The well casing was intact, and the bore had not been compromised by ground movement or tree root intrusion, which I'd considered the most likely failure mode. I tested the water with strips I kept in the workshop for exactly this kind of assessment. Slightly high in mineral content but within acceptable range. No bacterial contamination at the levels the strips could detect. A proper filtration and purification system would be required, and I had the materials for a basic gravity filter. Layers of sand, gravel, and activated charcoal in a sealed container feeding into a storage vessel that I could then treat with the calcium hypochlorite I kept in the workshop for pool maintenance. This was not complicated engineering.
It was the same basic principle as every low-infrastructure water system I'd ever worked on, applied at household scale with materials on hand. By Thursday afternoon, I had a functioning gravity-fed water system that did not depend on the municipal supply or on electrical power, drawing from a source that no external event could shut off without doing geological work. I tested it 3 times, adjusted the filtration layer ratio once, and moved on. The second red circle task was the basement entrance security. The horizontal steel exterior doors were already solid. The problem was the frame and the ground seal, which had deteriorated over years and left gaps that were structurally weak and allowed both moisture infiltration and the possibility of forced entry with relatively modest effort. I spent Thursday afternoon rebuilding the frame section using treated timber and construction adhesive, adding a second horizontal bar to the interior security system, and running a bead of spray foam around the complete perimeter where the door assembly met the concrete surround. This was unglamorous, but critical. A shelter is only as secure as its least secure point, and I'd learned this principle from working on pump station access doors in flood zones, where the temptation to address every large problem before the small ones could kill you. While I worked, I kept the radio running in the workshop. The news had changed quality by Thursday, and the smooth professional cadence of prepared broadcast journalism beginning to give way to something rougher and more immediate, the kind of unpolished, real-time reporting that surfaces when events are moving faster than editorial processes can manage. There were new place names, there were conflicting accounts, there were gaps where information should have been, and I'd learned enough about information systems to know that gaps are themselves information. They tell you which parts of the network are under too much strain to transmit normally. Portland was under a partial evacuation advisory. The highways east of the city were showing significant congestion. A state of emergency had been declared in 2 counties. 7 days, I thought again, maybe 6 now. Friday was the day I made the drive I'd been calculating since Wednesday. I want to explain this carefully because the decision to leave The property for several hours involved a genuine weighing of risks that I didn't take lightly. Every hour away from the property was an hour of preparation not happening, and it was also a window of exposure to the conditions that were developing in the wider environment. But there were things I needed that I couldn't source from what I had, and the window for safe acquisition was closing at a rate I could estimate, if not precisely measure. I left at 6 in the morning, the grey pre-dawn of a November day that smelled of frost and wet leaves. The truck moved quietly through streets that still looked ordinary, but felt like a stage set. The garbage cans at the curb, the light in a kitchen window, the early jogger on the corner, all of it proceeding with the apparent normalcy of the day before and the day before that, while underneath, in the network I could feel without quite seeing, something was already failing. I went to 4 places in a sequence I'd mapped the night before to minimize exposure time and backtracking. The hardware store first, opening at 6:30, where I bought specific materials, a hand pump to fit the well casing diameter, lengths of food-grade PVC pipe, additional spray foam and construction adhesive, a large quantity of heavy-gauge steel mesh for a window-blocking application I'd been designing, more lumber in the dimensions I needed. The hardware store owner was a man I'd been doing business with for 11 years.
A retired contractor named Dell who approached every transaction as though it were the beginning of a conversation he'd been looking forward to. He looked at my cart with an expression I recognized as the civilian equivalent of my own infrastructure analyst's pattern recognition, something registering that didn't fit the ordinary. He said, "Big project?" I said, "Renovation." He looked at me for a moment longer than the exchange required. Then he said, "How bad is it?" I considered what to tell him. Dell was 72 years old. He had a daughter in town with 3 children. He had been kind to me in the particular way of people who run small businesses and understand their relationship to the community that sustains them. I said, "Bad enough. Is your daughter's family prepared?" He said he didn't know. I said he should make sure she had water. At least 2 weeks. I told him where she might look for useful materials if the store was closed by the time she thought to come. I recognized, giving him information that would shorten the store's remaining useful inventory. I gave it anyway. I carried my own materials to the truck and drove to the second stop. The moral arithmetic of preparation in a collapsing world is not something I can resolve cleanly, and I want to be honest about that rather than narrate it away. Everything I acquired that Friday was things I paid for. I want to be clear about that. I am not a man who takes what isn't his, and the conditions outside had not yet reached the point where the ordinary rules of exchange had ceased to function, but I was acquiring things that others might need, in quantities that reflected a preparation they hadn't done, and there is no completely comfortable way to sit with that asymmetry. The second stop was a large outdoor and camping retailer, where I bought, among other things, a high-quality water filter rated for thousands of gallons, a substantial supply of freeze-dried and long-shelf-life food to supplement my own stores, 2 wool sleeping bags rated to temperatures I hoped I wouldn't need to test, and a hand-crank emergency radio that could receive both standard and emergency broadcast frequencies without requiring batteries. I also bought a manual can opener, which seems absurdly minor until the day you need it and don't have one. The third stop was a pharmacy, where I bought every reasonable medical supply that didn't require a prescription and several things that I had the residual prescription information to justify. Wound care in serious quantities, a blood pressure cuff and stethoscope, electrolyte powder, prescription-strength antifungals that I anticipated might become relevant in conditions of enclosed living. The pharmacist behind the counter was young and looked like she hadn't slept. The shelves behind her were showing gaps that had been full 3 days ago. The fourth stop was the fuel depot on the industrial edge of town, where I had an account from my years of infrastructure work. and where I filled 4 additional 5-gallon fuel containers for the generator and the truck reserve. Diesel stores better than gasoline, and I had always kept spare capacity. I was simply extending that capacity to what the truck bed could carry. I was back at the property by 11:30. I unloaded everything before I did anything else, moving with the efficient, unhurried urgency of someone who has learned that speed without organization wastes more time than it saves. Then I went inside, made lunch, ate it sitting at the kitchen table, and looked at the backyard for 15 minutes without doing anything. This was not idleness. It was the specific recovery window I'd learned to build into extended physical and cognitive work. 20 minutes of deliberate stillness to allow the processing that doesn't happen when the body is in motion. Aurelio, a man I'd worked alongside during a pipeline restoration project in Ecuador 20 years ago, an engineer who had also done disaster relief and who I thought about sometimes when facing problems that required both technical skill and human understanding. Aurelio had called this filling the reservoir. He said the people who ran dry early in emergencies were always the ones who never stopped moving long enough to refill. I thought about what remained to be done. 14 items on the list. 4 of them were major. The rest were the kind of detail work that accumulates into the difference between a shelter that holds and a shelter that fails for a reason you could have addressed. I went back to work. Friday afternoon and evening and most of Friday night I spent on the basement transformation. I want to describe this because the specifics of it matter to me. Not as a technical record, but because the act of making a space livable is an act of a particular kind of hope, and I find that I want to honor that. The basement was already dry and structurally sound. The first work was light management. Not because I was planning to hide from aerial detection, but because in a situation where light discipline becomes relevant, a basement that leaks visible light from every small gap in its above-ground windows becomes an advertisement. I covered the 4 small windows with the steel mesh first, screwed into the wooden window frames, and then applied the heavy plastic sheeting I'd bought as a second layer, sealed at every edge with construction adhesive and spray foam. This was not intended to be permanent. It could be removed and reinstalled relatively easily, but it was effective. When I turned off the main lights and crouched in the space, I was satisfied that nothing visible would escape at the level of the windows. I built the sleeping platforms from the lumber. 2 of them, because I was not planning for only myself. I'd decided this somewhere in the logistics of the previous days without stating it as a decision, in the way that certain premises embed themselves in a plan without needing formal declaration. Ben would arrive at some point, possibly others. The shelter needed to accommodate more than one person without the overcrowding that destroys group dynamics in enclosed spaces. 2 sleeping platforms built solidly with storage beneath and a full meter of clearance between them and the walls on at least one side. The water system I ran from the well into the basement through a pipe route that followed an existing conduit channel, bypassing the house's main plumbing and feeding into a 50-gallon tank I positioned on a shelf at head height to use gravity for pressure. It wasn't elegant, it was functional, reliable, and independent of the external grid in every meaningful way. I moved the food stores down on Saturday morning, a 2-hour process of transferring everything from the kitchen pantry and the chest freezer and the basement storage into a consolidated, organized, inventoried system on the shelves I'd built along the east wall. I did a full inventory as I transferred, dates checked, categories organized, a log started in a fresh notebook. 3 months of food for 1 person comfortably, 2 months for 2, supplementable with the garden when conditions permitted access to the yard. The generator I housed in the exterior basement access alcove, not inside the shelter proper, because carbon monoxide is a patient and invisible killer, and no convenience justifies the risk. I ran a conduit for the power output cable through a sealed fitting in the wall, with a valve I could closed from inside when the generator wasn't running. I had 40 gallons of diesel, used sparingly for lighting and the small electric heater on the coldest nights. It would last months. Saturday afternoon I spent on the security of the interior stairway door, replacing the hollow core door that had been there with a solid core door from the upstairs hallway that I'd never liked anyway, rehanging it with 3-inch screws into the stud framing and adding a heavy deadbolt that I keyed to a key I put on a cord around my neck. Saturday evening I sat in the basement for an hour by myself, by lantern light, and considered the space honestly. It was not comfortable in any ordinary sense. The concrete floor was cold. The smell of old building materials and fresh construction adhesive was present. The ceiling height was adequate but not generous. The light from the 2 lanterns created a warm pool that faded to shadow at the edges, and the small sounds of the house above, which continued because the house existed and had its own acoustic life, came through the floor in a muffled register, like sounds from a world that was not quite connected to this one. But it was real. It was mine. It would hold. I ate dinner down there at the small folding table I'd brought from the workshop, with the radio on its lowest useful volume, and the lantern casting its amber warmth across the notebook where I'd been writing the inventory. I thought about Claire, who had sometimes come down to the basement to retrieve preserved goods from the shelves, and who had always, without knowing she was doing it, made the space briefly warmer by being in it. I thought about Ben driving that route I'd described, the one we tested on a Sunday in the spring, and what it would feel like to hear him arrive at the back fence. I thought about the morning conversation with Dell at the hardware store, and whether his daughter had water, and all the Dell's daughters in this city who didn't know yet what the next week would ask of them. I finished dinner. I washed the bowl using the minimal water I determined was adequate for the task. I made a note in the inventory log and turned off one of the 2 lanterns. The darkness at the edge of the room was not threatening. It was simply the quality of a space that exists regardless of observation. I found that I could sit comfortably in the presence of it, which I took as a sign that the preparation was working on something more than the physical. Sunday carried a different texture than the days before it. The city was audible in ways that were new. Not one sound, but a layer of sounds that individually might have meant nothing but together had a frequency and urgency that I recognized as the early register of panic finding its way into the infrastructure of ordinary life. More traffic than a Sunday morning warranted. The distant sound of sirens that stopped and started at irregular intervals rather than the rhythmic Doppler passage of an emergency vehicle on a known route. A helicopter twice, moving from west to east and not returning. I didn't go into the city Sunday. I was not planning to go into the city again if I could help it. I spent Sunday completing the detail work. The categories on my list that weren't dramatic individually but accumulated into the difference between a plan that holds and a plan that doesn't. I waterproofed the exterior basement door frame further. I mapped 2 alternative exits from the property in writing with distance estimates and landmark notes, folding the paper and sealing it in a waterproof bag with the other critical documents I'd assembled. Property records, medical information,
A copy of the family contact information written in ink, not stored only on a phone whose battery would eventually be the most consequential number I owned. I confirmed that the hand crank radio could receive the emergency broadcast frequencies and recorded the intervals at which I checked them.
I prepared what I privately thought of as the outdoor kit, a pack containing the minimum viable set of materials for movement over extended terrain if the shelter became untenable and the Greenbelt corridor became necessary. Water filter, light food, basic tools, the first aid kit in its compact form, a compass and the topographic map of the watershed land I printed years ago for a hiking trip I'd never taken. I put this pack near the interior basement door, not in it, as a deliberate reminder that its presence was contingency planning, not intention. In the afternoon, I went out to the garden. The beds were quiet, in their winter rest, the soil dark and damp, the structure of the space intact. Claire's planting arrangements still evident in the way the garden organized itself around a logic that wasn't immediately obvious, but revealed itself over seasons. I walked the rows slowly, looking at what the year had left. Some root vegetables still in the ground, which I'd harvest selectively rather than all at once, preferring to leave them in their natural cold storage until needed. The apple tree at the corner, stripped of fruit but solid, its branches holding the grey sky with a patience that I found genuinely comforting. I pulled what I planned to use in the short term, took it inside, washed it, stored it carefully. Standing at the kitchen sink doing this, I was struck by how entirely ordinary the action was. Root vegetables from a garden washed in a sink on a Sunday afternoon in November, the same action that had happened 10,000 times in kitchens through human history. The same action that would, if things went reasonably well, continue to happen as long as I was careful and thoughtful and lucky in approximately the proportions that luck allows itself to be influenced by preparation. I set the vegetables on the counter. I stood at the window for a while. The light was fading in the west, behind the houses on the far side of the greenbelt, and the sky had turned the specific shade of purple-grey that I associated with late autumn evenings, a colour that had always felt like a kind of permission to stop, to come inside, to let the day close. I went downstairs. I turned on the radio. I made notes. Monday was the day the city changed in a way you could see as well as hear. I observed this from the property rather than from within it. I walked to the far end of the backyard where a slight elevation in the terrain and a gap in the greenbelt trees gave me a line of sight to a section of the commercial district 2 miles west. What I saw was not chaos, not yet, not there, but it had the quality of a system operating under stress that its design hadn't accommodated. Vehicles moving in patterns that didn't match the normal rhythms of a Monday morning. A column of smoke, thin and steady, from somewhere in the eastern part of the commercial strip. The kind of fire that starts from an accident in an unattended building rather than from deliberate action. An absence where there should have been presence. The delivery trucks that should have been moving along the main commercial corridor at this hour. The school buses, the ordinary machinery of a city keeping its metabolic appointments. The systems I'd spent my career maintaining were beginning to fail. I could see it in the behavior of the city, the way a doctor reads a patient. Not from any single symptom, but from the pattern of them together. I went back to the house. I made a list of the remaining tasks and their priority, reduced now to the things that were genuinely necessary rather than merely beneficial. I had been working from a larger list and narrowing it by completion and by the changing calculus of time and risk. The list now contained 8 items, 4 of them major, 4 of them the kind of finishing detail that I would address as I could. Ben called at 10:15 Monday morning. He said the campus administration had sent an email advising students to shelter in place pending further guidance, which is the kind of institutional language that translates, in practical terms, to, we don't know what to tell you, but we're maintaining the appearance of institutional authority for as long as we can. I told him the campus wasn't going to be a viable, long-term position, and that he should plan to move within the next 24 hours. I reminded him of the route and the marker, and the specific sound he should make at the back fence. 2 knocks, a pause, 2 more, so that I would know it was him. He said, "Dad, I'm not going to leave without my roommate. Marcus doesn't have anywhere to go." I had been expecting something like this, not precisely this, but the shape of it. The moment when the plan encounters the human element that plans always under account for. I had been alone in my thinking for most of the previous 5 days, operating with the focused efficiency that solitude permits, And I had felt the cleanness of that, the absence of complication, and now Ben was telling me, in the voice he'd used since childhood, when he was doing something he'd already decided to do, and was informing me rather than asking permission, that the plan was going to include someone it hadn't included before. I was quiet for a moment, not resisting the idea, but examining it, running the practical implications against the inventory and the space calculations and the social dynamics of enclosed long-term cohabitation. Then I said, "Is Marcus someone you trust?" Ben said yes, without hesitation. I said, "Then bring him. Come tonight if you can." I went back down to the basement after the call and looked at the space with the revised population in mind. 3 people. The 2 sleeping platforms were large enough. I added a third, narrower, in the remaining available floor space along the south wall, spending 2 hours I hadn't planned to spend on it. I revised the food rationing calculations. 6 weeks for 3 at the current inventory, extendable to 3 months with careful management and the garden's supplemental contribution. The arithmetic was tighter, but workable. That was the right way to think about it. Ben and Marcus arrived at 11:40 Monday night. I heard the careful sound at the back fence. 2 knocks, a pause, 2 more, and it landed in my chest in a way that surprised me, the simple relief of hearing a signal you'd been waiting for. I opened the back gate with the flashlight held low, and there they were. Ben, looking the way he always looked in situations that required him to be competent, focused, slightly quiet, his mother's composure in his face, and Marcus, a young man I'd met once before at a campus event, tall and studying mechanical engineering, who shook my hand at the gate with a formality that I respected. I brought them inside. I gave them food and water and let them sit for 20 minutes without asking anything of them. This is something I'd learned from relief work, that people who have been in motion through difficulty need a specific interval of stillness before they can receive new information effectively. Their nervous systems are still processing the journey. If you fill that interval with tasks and instructions, the information doesn't land properly. After 20 minutes, I gave them the orientation, the basement, the resources, the protocols I'd established, the reasons for each. Ben listened with the attentiveness of someone confirming information he'd partially expected. Marcus listened with the sharper attention of someone encountering an entirely new situation and cataloguing it in real time. I liked him immediately for the quality of his listening. I showed them the emergency pack by the door. I showed them the water system and explained the filter maintenance. I showed them where the medical kit was and made sure both of them understood the basic contents. Then I told them the rule that mattered most. We make decisions together, not by vote. I have final authority on things that are time critical, but nothing significant happens without all 3 of us understanding it and agreeing with the reasoning. Questions are not weakness. Questions are how we catch mistakes before they cost us something we can't recover. Marcus nodded. He said, "That's good engineering?" I said, "That's the only kind." Tuesday and Wednesday were the last days I spent with significant above-ground activity. The city was clearly in a different state now. I didn't need to observe from the elevated point in the backyard, because I could hear it from inside the house. The sirens that had been intermittent were now nearly continuous, then went silent all at once on Tuesday evening in a way that was worse than the sound had been. The emergency broadcast radio began delivering information in the flat, scripted voice that I associated with situations where the institutions responsible for public safety were still performing their function but had lost confidence in the information they were transmitting. I made my final supply acquisitions from the property itself. The last of the garden roots, the remaining firewood from the shed stacked outside, tools from the workshop that I wanted inside the shelter, rather than in buildings I might not be able to access safely. Ben and Marcus helped with this, and I was grateful for their company, in the specific way you're grateful for company during physical work. The quiet, collaborative rhythm of people doing useful things together. The economy of words that develops when a group has reached an understanding. On Wednesday afternoon, a man I didn't know appeared at the front of the property. I watched him from the upstairs window. He was alone, middle-aged, dressed in a manner that suggested he'd been traveling for some time, and he was standing at the end of the driveway in a posture that expressed uncertainty rather than threat. He didn't approach the house. He stood for perhaps 3 minutes looking at it, and then moved on down the street. I stood at the window after he'd gone and let myself feel the weight of that, because I think it's important to feel the weight of things, even when you can't change them. He might have been fine. He might have needed nothing more than reassurance. He might have been something entirely different than he appeared. I didn't know, and the not knowing was a cost that the preparation had not accounted for, because no preparation can account for it. The cost of choosing the shelter over the unknown stranger at the gate. I wrote about this in the notebook that evening. I don't know why I wrote it, rather than just carrying it, perhaps because writing it made it real in a way that I could examine, rather than leaving it in the interior, where things blur and simplify themselves into whatever form is most livable. He had a face, he had a direction he was walking, he had reasons I would never know. The world was full of people with reasons I would never know. The shelter couldn't hold all of them. That was true, and it would remain true, and I would have to find a way to continue making decisions inside that truth, without letting it hollow me out. Wednesday night, we moved into the shelter. Not in crisis. This was not a hasty retreat from immediate threat, but a planned transition made at a moment of our choosing rather than necessity, which was exactly how I had intended it. We carried the last items down the interior stairs and through the basement door. I did a final walkthrough of the house, which I performed with the deliberate attention I gave to things I was not certain I would see again. The kitchen, where I had drunk thousands of cups of coffee and had 100 ordinary conversations, and stood at the window in the early morning watching the garden come and go with the seasons. The hallway, where Claire's photograph was. Not the formal portrait, but the one from a hiking trip, laughing at something off camera, her hair moving in a wind I could almost feel from 30 years' distance. Ben's old room still containing the artifacts of a childhood he'd grown past, but not yet fully disowned. I took the photograph of Claire from the hallway. I took it downstairs and placed it on the shelf above the notebook, between the lantern and the water filter. It was not a grand gesture, it was simply the continuation of a habit I'd maintained for 4 years, keeping her in the rooms I lived in. I secured the interior door, I set the bar. The three of us sat in the basement shelter in the lantern light, and the sounds of the city above us and around us were present but contained, attenuated by concrete and soil and the geological patience of the ground, reduced to something that could be observed rather than experienced. A distant sound that might have been many things, a vibration in the air that was more feeling than sound. The world conducting its terrible business a certain distance away from where we were sitting. Ben was looking at the photograph of his mother on the shelf. He looked at it for a while, and I watched him look at it, and neither of us said anything about it, because there wasn't anything to say that the looking hadn't already said more precisely. Marcus had brought a book, a thick engineering textbook that he'd had in his bag, and he opened it on his knee with the focused matter-of-factness of someone who understood that a mind with work to do is a mind in better condition than a mind left to its own resources in better condition than a mind left to its own resources in confined, uncertain circumstances. I had already decided I liked him, and this confirmed it. I opened the notebook. I wrote the date, the inventory, the status of each system. I noted that all 3 air circulation pathways were functioning. I noted the temperature, the water supply level, the food inventory as of that morning. I noted that conditions outside had deteriorated to a level that indicated remaining in the shelter was the correct decision for an indefinite period. Then I closed the notebook and sat with the lantern light for a while. The first week in the shelter had its own texture, its own rhythm, its own particular relationship with time. Time in an enclosed space with finite variation develops differently than time in the open world. Not slower exactly, but more granular, more attentive to its own passage, marked by the small routines that replace the external signals of ordinary life. We established a schedule in the first 2 days and kept to it with a discipline that I recognized as essential. Not rigidity, but structure, because structure is what keeps the mind oriented when the environment provides no orientation of its own. Mornings began with the water check and the inventory update, which I did myself while Ben and Marcus were still waking, then the radio. 10 minutes, noting any information the emergency broadcast provided, cross-referencing it with what I could infer from the ambient sounds that filtered through the concrete. Then breakfast, made together, the small collaborative ritual of 3 people in a kitchen-sized space producing food, which turns out to be surprisingly effective at generating the ordinary warmth of shared human activity, regardless of circumstances. The afternoons we divided between individual occupation and shared work. There was always maintenance to do. The water system needed checking, the air circulation needed monitoring, the food inventory needed regular update as we used it. We improved the shelter in small ways over those first days. Better organization of the shelves and a curtain improvised from a sleeping bag to provide private space around the sleeping platforms. A small but meaningful upgrade to the ventilation that Ben engineered from materials we had on hand with a neatness that made me quietly proud. Evenings were the best part. We talked, not always about the situation, more often about other things, the deliberate, ranging conversation of people choosing not to let their circumstances define the entire scope of their mental lives. Marcus talked about his family in Atlanta, his mother who was a nurse, and his father who ran a small electrical contracting business, people who I formed a clear picture of through his descriptions and whose competence and resourcefulness he clearly trusted. Ben talked about his mother more than he had in 4 years, in the way that enclosed space and uncertain circumstances seem to dissolve certain barriers to the subjects we carry but don't open. He told Marcus about her. Her laugh, her garden, her reading glasses pushed down her nose, and I sat with my notebook and listened, and occasionally I contributed something, a memory or a detail, and the 3 of us built something in those evenings that I don't have a precise name for, but that felt like exactly the kind of warmth that turns a shelter from a hiding place into a home. 12 days after we moved in, I made the first careful surface excursion. Before I went above ground, I spent 2 full days observing through the air conduit, which I'd extended with a small flexible section that I could angle toward the backyard and the greenbelt boundary. I timed the intervals between sounds. I mapped the patterns of what I could hear, which had changed significantly from the first week, the continuous sirens now replaced by a deeper, more ambient stillness that had its own quality of information, a stillness that felt not like absence, but like a world that had reorganized itself into something that moved differently than it had before. I went out at 4 in the morning, moving slowly through the horizontal basement doors into the backyard. The temperature had dropped significantly, the kind of cold that comes in through December and settles, the grass rigid and silver with frost, the apple tree a dark geometry against a sky that was fully overcast, but provided enough diffused light to move by. I stood in the garden for a full minute without moving, listened. The city 2 miles west was quiet, in a way that no city has ever been quiet in my experience. Not the quiet of 3 in the morning when only the insomniacs and the night shift were awake. Something deeper, something that came from the absence of the machinery of ordinary human activity, The furnaces, the refrigerators, the lights, the 1,000 small electrical processes that a functioning city maintains continuously without anyone noticing them until they stop. But there were sounds. Distant, irregular, with the quality of events rather than the quality of background. From the east, occasional movement in the greenbelt. From the west, once, a sound I identified and then deliberately did not examine further. From the sky, nothing. Which was itself informative because there had been helicopters for most of the first week, and their absence suggested something about the operational capacity of whoever had been flying them. I moved carefully along the fence to the garden, checked the remaining root vegetables. More than I'd expected, the cold having preserved rather than destroyed what was left, and harvested what I could carry in the bag I'd brought. I assessed the apple tree, the tool shed, the workshop building, the exterior of the house, everything structurally intact, no evidence of entry, the truck in the driveway exactly as I'd left it. I went back below ground inside 20 minutes. I brought Ben and Marcus the root vegetables, and they both looked at me for a moment in the particular way that people look at someone who has crossed a threshold and returned. And I told them what I'd observed with a careful factual register I'd been maintaining in the notebook. What I'd seen, what I'd heard, what I hadn't seen or heard, and what that suggested. Ben said, "Was it bad out there?"
I considered how to answer that honestly. I said, "It's different. It's not what it was, but we're okay. The shelter is doing what it's supposed to do." He nodded. Marcus was already writing something in his notebook, his own log, which he'd started on the second day and maintained with an engineer's precision that I found genuinely reassuring. I put the root vegetables on the kitchen shelf and sat down at the table and wrote my own entry, the date, the observations, the condition of the property, the condition of the supplies, the condition of the three of us, which was the inventory that mattered most. I want to tell you about a moment that happened on the 18th day, because I think it is the truest thing I have to say about what all of this preparation was actually for. It was evening,
And Ben had been talking about his mother again, and at some point the conversation had shifted naturally into territory we'd never quite entered before. Not the grief, not the loss, but the things she'd given us that we were still discovering, the habits of thought, the particular quality of attention she'd brought to small things, the garden. Ben said, "She would have thought this was ridiculous, you know. She would have said we were being dramatic." I laughed. It was true. Claire had been the specific kind of person who trusted the world to be basically functional, who believed in the institutional systems and the civic fabric, and the ordinary human decency that knits communities together, and who would have found my civil engineer's analysis of systemic failure modes pessimistic to the point of being impolite. She would not have liked the shelter. She would have found it excessive. And I thought about what she had said in the kitchen that Saturday morning, 3 years before any of this. If the world ever ended, I think you'd actually be fine. And I understood, sitting in the lantern light of the shelter we'd built, why she'd said, "you," and not "we." Not because she'd known she wouldn't be here, but because she'd trusted me specifically to know what to do when the ordinary systems stopped functioning. She had identified something in me that she hadn't qualified with a condition. She hadn't said, "if you have enough supplies," or "if you prepare correctly." She had said "fine," which is a word that contains more than survival. It contains the idea of continuing, of carrying forward. Ben was watching me. He said, "What are you thinking about?" I said, "Your mother." He nodded. The way you nod when a thing that needs no elaboration is said clearly. Marcus, who had learned to read the rhythms of the three of us with a sensitivity I hadn't expected, but had come to depend on, got up quietly and made the evening tea from the dried herbs I'd brought from the garden. He set it on the table without commentary, and the three of us sat with it in the amber light, and the shelter was warm. And outside, the world was doing whatever it was doing at its particular distance, and we were here. On the 24th day I heard Nora's voice. She had reached her friend's property in the Willamette Valley, a working farm with a well and substantial food stores, and 6 other people who had come together in the early days of the outbreak with the practical competence that rural life tends to produce. She'd found a working radio and had been broadcasting on an emergency frequency at specific intervals, and I caught her on the hand-crank receiver at 2 in the afternoon, while Marcus was running the system checks and Ben was asleep on the sleeping platform. Her voice was calm and clear and sounded like her.
Entirely and simply like her, which was the most important thing. I told her we were secure. I told her Ben was with me. I told her the shelter had performed as designed. She told me about the farm, the people there, the routines they'd established, the way the valley had been largely bypassed by the worst of the outbreak in its first waves, which geography had favored them with and which they were not taking for granted. She said, "Are you okay, Dad? Actually okay?" I thought about this in the honest way she deserved.
The shelter, the 3 of us, the photograph on the shelf, the root vegetables from the garden, the notebook filled with precise and loving record of a period of time that no amount of preparation can fully contain. The river of small decisions and unremarkable careful work and long practice patience that had brought us here to this particular moment under this particular overcast December sky. I said, "Yes, actually okay." She said, "Mom was right then." And I said she usually was. I'm telling you all of this from the shelter, which is where I still am. It's been 31 days. The radio tells us things have changed in certain regions, stabilized in others, remain unclear in still others. The picture is fragmentary and will remain so for some time. There are decisions ahead that I can't model fully yet. When to move, where to go, how to navigate whatever shape the world is taking in the regions we can't see from here. Those decisions will require the same discipline as these ones: slow thinking, honest inventory, the deliberate patience of someone who has learned that the quality of your decisions matters more than their speed. But that is for later. For now, the shelter holds. The water system runs its quiet gravity-fed process from the well we restored, the cold mineral water moving through the filter and into the tank with a sound like a very distant stream. The food shelves are organized and sufficient. The lantern burns its measured hours. Ben sleeps on the platform to my left, one arm across his face the way he has slept since he was 8 years old. Marcus writes in his notebook. He is, I've learned, writing something more than a log, something that looks like it might eventually be a real account of this period. And I think he should write it, because these days deserve to be written. I have Claire's garden journal on the shelf. I have read it 3 times now, each reading finding things I hadn't noticed before. The small precise observations, the patient record of what failed and what came back. There is an entry from 11 years ago about the apple tree. Thought we might lose it this winter after the ice damage. It came through. These things are harder to kill than they look. I close the journal and set it down and look at the ceiling of the shelter, which is my basement's concrete floor seen from below, and through that the soil and roots of the backyard, and above that the garden, and above that the December sky. The apple tree is still out there. I checked when I went up 3 days ago. Still standing, branches holding, the same patient architecture of bare wood against the sky that has not changed in the years since Claire planted it. The root vegetables are still in the ground, waiting. These things are harder to kill than they look. I write this in the notebook and close it and turn down the lantern to its lowest setting, the one that leaves just enough light to read by if you hold the page close, and I sit in the quiet shelter with the sound of my son breathing and the distant, indeterminate world doing its strange business above the ground, and I find that what I feel underneath the vigilance and the careful calculation and the measured logistics of this life we have made in a basement beneath a garden, what I feel is something close to peace. Not the peace of resolution, because nothing is resolved, not the peace of safety, because nothing is fully safe, but the peace of a man who has done the thing he was equipped to do in the time he was given to do it, with enough care and enough love mixed into the practical mathematics of survival to make the shelter something more than a place to wait. The lantern burns, the water moves through its filter, the world, whatever it is becoming, continues above us. I'll tell you more when there is more to tell. For now, this is enough. More than enough. This is exactly enough. Rest now.